collusion/collusive oligopolies. Another major characteristic oligopolies exhibit has to be uncertainty. But why is there uncertainty in oligopolies? Let's use the two oligopolistic firms of Coke and Pepsi as an example. Let's say the price of sugar went up. How would these two firms respond? A normal assumption would be that both firms, since the price of raw materials has increased, they would both increase prices. However, in reality, due to the oligopolistic nature of these firms, this does not happen. As if Pepsi decide to increase their price in line with the increased price of raw materials, they have absolutely no idea if Coca-Cola will do the same. And as explained in the previous video, if Coca-Cola keeps a low price compared to Pepsi's high price, Pepsi will lose out significantly on quantity demanded, therefore lose out on revenue. This leads to quite an anxious scenario for both firms as they both wait for each other to make the first move. This is ultimately why there is uncertainty in decision making in oligopolies, and especially anything to do with price. And also this ties into the reasons for price stickiness and price rigidity. Let's put everything I've just said into a few words. So, each firm's decisions directly affect other firms, therefore they must try to anticipate their rival firm's moves, which ultimately creates a chess-like guessing game. But this nail-biting guessing game is extreme hassle for oligopolies. So how do they solve this? They instead turn to colluding. Now, I hope you can understand why firms, especially oligopolistic firms, are so accustomed to colluding. As if these firms collude, they no longer have to go through those sleepless nights of trying to guess what the other firm is going to do. They can just communicate with the other firm to remove all uncertainty. A great definition to memorize is how we define collusion. This is where two or more firms agree to limit competition, and specifically competition. Now, a very popular example you may actually see on exam day in your case studies is the OPEC cartel. So the oil cartel, which controls around 80% of the world oil reserves. Moving on, what are the reasons why firms decide to move from trying to guess the other firm's next move to then just colluding? Quite simply, why do firms collude? Definitely one of the biggest reasons that links to the classical economic assumption that firms are profit maximizers is just to simply help maximize joint profits in the long run. And of course, the key word here is joint, so profits for all the firms in the collusive agreement. And then secondly, another major reason is competition. If firms are colluding, they are no longer competing on price, meaning they can avoid that horrible price competition, for example, price wars, desperately undercutting each other, which in turn does lead to destroying both firms' revenues and profits. When mentioning collusion, you can show your examiner your depth of knowledge by talking about the two different types of collusion, which of course would be overt and tacit. The way I used to remember this is think about overt as a negative type of collusion and tacit as the so-called positive type of collusion. Let's define them. So overt is a formal agreement between firms to collude. So this could be any sort of communication directly between the two firms. And of course, the OPEC cartel would be a massive example of this because no one is fooled, they are not tacitly colluding. Secondly, tacit collusion. This is an unspoken agreement between firms, therefore meaning there is no direct communication between these two colluding firms. And usually when we see tacit collusion is using the price strategy of price leadership, which we'll cover in a future video. But the example here is the UK supermarket industry do tacitly collude via price leadership. Let's go a slight bit more in depth with these two types of collusion. So why is overt collusion seen as a negative one out of the two types of collusion? This is due to that communication between those two firms allows them to avoid competition, fix prices high, which in turns negatively affects consumers. Why does that negatively affect consumers? If these firms were engaging in price competition, for example, price wars, where they're desperately undercutting each other in price to steal consumers away, that will lead to lower prices for consumers, therefore increases in consumer surplus. However, if these firms collude, they avoid competition, therefore no longer need to compete on price and can fix prices high, which therefore negatively affects consumers due to reducing consumer surplus and many other things. And then by firms colluding, they can set higher barriers to entry, meaning that it limits competition in the market, leading to, again, worse worse off for consumers. Why? Because they have less choice of products. Moving on. The role of the government in a society is to improve the allocation of resources for the public. It can do that by increasing social welfare, so it definitely wants to deter firms from pursuing practices such as overt collusion. Thus, if firms are found overtly colluding, they are handed massive fines by the CMA, so the Competition and Markets Authority. But it doesn't stop there. These firms which are caught overtly colluding are named and shamed. And when consumers find out their favourite brand, their favourite shop has been exploiting them, has been scamming them, it severely ruins brand image. This incentivizes consumers to substitute away, which decreases a firm's quantity demanded, therefore decreases a firm's revenue, in turns decreasing the main thing firms are pursuing, a firm's profits. A great example of this is back in 2013 with Starbucks. So Starbucks was found massively tax avoiding, and when this hit the news and consumers found out about this, they were not too happy, and it actually led to a 30 million loss in sales for Starbucks. Another example, slightly more specific to the CMA, has to be 2015 Tesco, which of course is the largest supermarket in terms of market share in the UK. It was fined 85 million by the Competition and Markets Authority for colluding and fixing prices on dairy products. Moving on, let's imagine you are a firm in a collusive agreement. And why would a firm in a collusive agreement whistleblow or snitch? So the reason why a firm may whistleblow in a collusive agreement is it can gain them a competitive advantage. And why is that? So the firm that snitches on that collusive agreement, the firm that comes forward first, would receive immunity, whereas the competitor firm in that collusive agreement would incur the massive fines from the CMA and a loss of brand image like we mentioned previously. Therefore, the firm in the whistleblowing agreement, as you need to remember, these firms in these collusive agreements will be in the same segment of the market and will be harsh rivals. Therefore, if this firm can get one over on them by snitching on them, it means they can therefore gain that competitive advantage in the market. An example of when this happened was in construction firms. So Scudder whistleblew on the collusive cartel agreement they had for bid rigging for asbestos removal contracts. However, in this scenario, this firm did not actually receive immunity. They still incurred fines, but it was nowhere near the fines and the ruining of the brand image that the firms who did not whistleblow received.